I'm King Link and it's November 2023, so it's time for the Humble Choice November 2023 review. I've had a chance to do an 8-hour straight stream of all the titles this month, as well as having a lot of previous experience with 3 of them, so I'm here ready to tell you what I think of each title, what they're like, and who should check them out. There's a ton to talk about, so let's just get started with the title I already owned. Hardspace Shipbreaker, a casual game about ripping apart giant hulking spacecrafts. Hardspace Shipbreaker could easily have the word simulator added to the end of it. This is a game in the same vein as House Flipper or Power Wash Simulator. Each ship almost feels like a puzzle box, with players needing to split the ship apart and then sort it for it to be broken down. It's a strange but rewarding experience for the right type of people. There's also an upgrade system for your tools and a rig system that will provide harder and harder ships to break apart. One thing here that really never worked for me in this title after playing it for 30 hours on my own is the story. I can rip the story apart piece by piece, but honestly, it's more about how it's told. Rather than having chatter while you're working on a ship for 15-minute shifts each day, instead, the story is told in a passive experience where you're forced to stand or sit still while the game lectures you in a blunt way, usually with one person talking to you and no responses from the player character. There's also not a ton to do after you finish the game, and this is only going to appeal to some people who like that incremental type of game where they grind down a large debt. Kind of like real life. Pick this up if you like that simulator genre that I mentioned. This is a very slow game, like I said. I spent about 30 hours here, but it's also extremely chill and relaxed, and honestly, I enjoyed the entire time I played it. My biggest issue is I want more. More challenges, more ships, and maybe some unique challenges. That's honestly a pretty good complaint after spending 30 hours with the title.
The largest arms in the world, and a force that the WWE has never produced an equal to. You can't deny the impact of Hulkamania, but right now...
WWE 2K23. Wrestling and microtransactions. Of course. WWE 2K23 tries to remind players of why wrestling is big. It has all the big, brighter-than-life experiences that fans might want, the loud personalities, the big events, and the amazing spectacle, and in the right moment, you'll get caught up in it and see amazing stunts. While the controls feel almost like suggestions at times, it's still awe-inspiring to see your chosen wrestler dominate in the ring. But the problem is there's also so many negatives. There's a whole microtransaction mode, but because of that mode, every fighter has a rating and a stat for their card. Very little feels custom, so when Hulk Hogan fights Andre the Giant, his size and weight really aren't accounted for. There's also a lot of advertising, just like the Snickers logo plastered everywhere because they sponsored WrestleMania for this year. Pick this up if you love the spectacle of wrestling, but you'll be buying this more for the spectacle. The rest of the game is fine, but honestly, it's just fine. However, for the modern wrestling fans, you probably already had this. For fans of the legend of wrestling, I'm sure there are better games out there than this. This just feels so gross with the microtransactions and everything being a card, and there's just a lot of itemization, even if not everything is paid for by cash. And yes, that is a modern game, or at least a modern sports game, but that doesn't mean I'm going to ignore or praise a game for diving into those practices. Unpacking. Storytelling by finding a place for everything. Unpacking is mostly about a unique narrative told through the act of unpacking boxes. The player has to open boxes, move items around to figure out where everything goes, and it can be as simple as finding an underwear drawer and throwing all the panties in it. But it also can be anything from finding a good place for a clock radio or a diary. The problem is there's not a lot of puzzle. When the game is confusing and players can't figure out what's wrong with their choice, the game just kind of waits until the player figures it out, and that's just frustrating it. The player sometimes doesn't even know what an object is, which makes finding a place for it about clicking around rather than storytelling, and I actually had to look at a guide to find out that I couldn't hang a towel because an object was underneath it. The game didn't tell me that itself. Now, before someone tells me, I know that intentionally there is no text, but without that text, it often feels like the storytelling can be accidental. I'm going to heavily avoid spoilers, but when something has to go under the bed, players of the game will know exactly what I'm talking about. It feels more like a problem with the design of the apartment in the game than a point in the narrative, because no direct rule is being explained to the player. Instead, it's just where the game will allow you to place something. Now, this isn't a horrible negative, but it is something that has always bothered me with the praise this game gets for that specific moment. Pick this up if you want a story told uniquely. Not necessarily a unique story, but this delivers an experience unlike anything else. That being said, it is only about 2 hours long and it's more of a game to be discussed than a game to challenge players. I am torn on this, but I did enjoy my first playthrough and this time was interesting enough.
We're one big happy cartridge family.
That's DJB Newton, see?
Friends vs. Friends. But what if you don't have friends? Friends vs. Friends is an online-only first-person shooter where players can play cards to activate abilities and then fight each other in a battle for the best out of 5. There are deck-building aspects and the players will spend a lot of time opening packs and leveling up cards for small progression, luckily none of that microtransaction-based. There are several different systems here and it creates a good feedback loop for playing the game. But ultimately, I feel like this is a game for top-tier FPS players who probably already have a lot of other options. Steam chart says there's only a peak of around 300 players playing this right now, and that's pretty good, but while I did well enough to get some highlights to show you here, it's really hard to get up to speed when the teams are going to be stomping over you in the early game. Pick this up if you need a good FPS, or you want to challenge a friend of yours who also has this game. I like the art, the voice acting is actually hilarious at times, and the gameplay is good. There's just a limited amount of content, 4 maps, and only 1v1 or 2v2 that is available. Bots will only be good for, honestly, about 5 minutes, as I won both the games I played with them, and yet never won more than a couple rounds online, never a full game. Prodeus, Doom 2020. As I play Prodeus, I really couldn't help myself. This is a game that screams Doom's name as it emulates the king of all shooters so hard. And yet that's actually me praising Prodeus. Levels look great, the music got my blood pumping, and the enemies, while taken from Doom, at least most of them, look awesome. This feels like a version of the original Doom done in the modern era with a similar sized team. This just gives me flashbacks to 30 years ago when I was running around Phobos and Deimos for the first time, just having the most awesome time blasting enemies to a variety of levels. Prodeus is a boomer shooter that seems to remind people why this genre is popular rather than trying to reinvent the wheel at every turn. I wish I could just end there. But Prodeus does have some issues. There's almost no difficulty in the early levels. I played on medium and rarely went below 90% of my health and armor. On ultra hard, the hardest difficulty level, I had almost no depth the entire 3rd level, and the respawn system will trivialize the difficulty, I think. I've heard the game does get harder after what people call the first world, but experienced players won't be too challenged by this one. Pick this up if you were ever a fan of the original Doom. This lives up to that original incarnation, and that's about as much praise as I can give almost any game. I'd have to play more, but I could even see giving this a nod over Doom Eternal, as sacrilegious as that is to say. I like it that much. Legend of Tianding, a Taiwanese folk hero story and a beat-em-up. Legend of Tianding has players taking on the role of a famous folk hero from Taiwan in what amounts to a form of Robin Hood, robbing the corrupt rich and giving to the poor. This is done through excellent platforming, a solid beat-em-up with a special ability for players to steal enemy weapons after enough damage is done. There's also a variety of upgrades and collectibles that players can chase after throughout the game. That being said, the combat is good, but it's going to be a typical beat-em-up outside of a few enemies. The bosses are all great, but there are a lot of ways to stunlock enemies, and being able to steal their weapons render them almost simple to beat. The one thing I remember from the first time I played it though is there's a decent amount of running around and backtracking, which does slow down the pace of the game in a bad way. Pick this up if you like what you're seeing and want a good beat 'em up. The level design here is good, and while there's a bit of repetition, the art, story, and gameplay are still very well done.
This must be the elevator. To the 7th floor, then.
SCP Secret Files, an anthology of spookiness. SCP Secret Files involves players experiencing 5 stories, each with a different style and different gameplay, at least that's what I've gathered online. The 2 stories I actually went through were a very simple collection minigame and a spooky office. Well, kind of. SCP as a mythos is all about everyday objects and the anomalies they hide. The first story had a desert that, honestly, it's not exactly clear what's going on, but the experience heavily unsettled me, and the second story had me jumping at mannequins, though I'll hold off on saying more about that. At the same time, this being an anthology, that means 5 stories, 5 types of games, and 5 different qualities, and not all of them are the best. The desert story was a bit weak, and the office was damn creepy. Both will probably stick with me, but the direct experience wasn't consistent, and the other stories will also change formats, which means who knows what the rest of the game will be like. Pick this up if you're a fan of the SCP mythos and want to be spooked, if not completely terrified. This has a great quality to the writing and experience, but like I said, it's going to be up to the player, and I can't say more than I won't be returning because I don't like how nervous the game was making me. But that's actually a positive opinion on a horror game because I am a little scaredy cat. Souldiers, a Metroidvania with 3 playable classes. In Souldiers, I hope I'm pronouncing that right, you can choose to play as a warrior, an archer, or a mage, and it looks like all 3 will have different experiences or at least different combat options. It is what feels like a massive world awaiting the player, with the first area being a spider slayer, and inside is a large map with a lot of opportunities to double back when the player earns new abilities. The combat is slick, and before long it will challenge the players along with the major boss battles in the game. However, I didn't see much more than that first area. I've heard from someone that I really trust, the game's launch was problematic with a lot of issues. Those reviews are on Steam, of course. However, it does appear a lot of changes have happened since then, including 3 new difficulty modes to address a big issue people had, and the challenge here feels more reasonable, though also I've heard the first area is more polished than others. Pick this up if you want a big Metroidvania and want to take a risk. There are a lot of differing opinions on this game, but it does seem like the studio was able to take the negative reviews and improve on the game rather than letting it suffer a slow death. I can't speak to that as I didn't get far enough to truly experience the entirety of this game though. And that's what I have for this month. But of course, let's do our monthly trip to isthereadeal.com, and the answer is of course, yes. WWE has never been below $26, Prodeus has never been below $16, and Hardspace Shipbreaker has never been below $12. So getting any of those games, and the addition of 7 others, is a pretty great deal. Also, none of these games have been bundled before, at least on this list, which is a very refreshing sight. I will throw out that there's also a free month of DC Comics Ultimate or something like that, so if you like DC Comics, that's a pretty good add-on, but probably not worth the entire price itself. On the other hand, Humble Game Collection is no more, but that might mean we see the games like Unpacking and Prodeus that Humble published now given to players instead of just rented in the game collection. Also, speaking of WWE 2K23 before, you know how there's always people saying they want $60 AAA titles? Hey guys, that's one of them. Now people will quickly say, well, that's not what they meant, and I understand, but that's the type of $60 title you're going to see in Humble for better or worse. Honestly, I wish it was a lot better. There are a couple good genres covered this month, 2 FPSs, 1 online and 1 offline, quite a few side-scrollers, a couple casual games in there, so there's a lot of area covered in this title. Let's talk about the tier list though. As always, 4 categories: games worth the full bundle prices, strong contenders, average games, and misses. This is of course a discussion of the game's essence, and not necessarily just a price comparison, which I hope most of you could do yourself. Let's get started with the bottom. At the bottom, I have to put it here, it's Friends vs. Friends. First off, it's not a dead game, but the skill level is already so high, and even with skill-based matchmaking, you're going to get slaughtered here unless you're already a pro gamer, and if you love the genre that much, you probably have better choices, but for everyone else, this probably isn't worth it. I do want to see more from this studio though. And we'll just move up to the average tier right away, which starts with WWE 2K23. I've tried to get behind this game, but average is the perfect word for it. Perhaps it's better than WWE 2K22, it would have to be better than 2K20, but that doesn't make it great, you know? There's another game in average, and this is going to be controversial. It's Unpacking. Listen, I love the idea of this game, I like the storytelling, but it's 2 hours long with either no puzzles or obtuse puzzles. I'm not saying don't play it, but it's just not enough bang in your buck for the entire bundle price. Definitely try it out if you do pick up the entire bundle. So this is what we're looking at after 2 tiers. 5 games to go, so let's move on to the next one. The Strong Contenders tier has Souldiers. This is a really solid game, but I don't know if I could call it great just yet. I have hope, but there's also a small part of my mind that wonders if it will slump eventually. Still, it's enjoyable enough to be here. Top of the Strong Contenders, SCP Secret File. Yeah, I don't like this, but if you want a horror game, you can do a lot worse than this title, and I'm only stopping because I was getting too freaked out. Again, that's a pretty good recommendation from me. And here's how we look. Yep, 3 games remaining in the full bundle. Let's break them down. Start at the bottom with my favorite title this month, Hardspace Shipbreaker, and I do truthfully mean that. If this was a list for King Link, Hardspace would be at the top, but I will also recognize that this appeals to a specific type of gamer, and if you don't love the simulator genre, this is probably not for you. Still, if you do pick up the bundle, give this title a shot, it might surprise you. Next up we have Prodeus, Original Doom in 2020. I'm going to keep saying that though because that sums up why I'm such a fan, but also why this game got as popular as it did. Check this out if you think fondly of that original Doom title. It's not going to be on the same level as the modern interpretations of the game, especially because of team size, but I also wouldn't want that overproduced style of game here. This is great just as it is. Finally, we have Legend of Tianding. Maybe it's a game from a foreign studio, maybe it's a foreign folk story, or maybe it's just a great game in art design, but Legend of Tianding doesn't feel like many other games. Whether that's for the good with the platforming or bad for the fetch quests that break up the game is for the player to decide. So this is how the final tier list looks, and honestly I'm pretty happy. I wanted my copy of Tianding, technically also Unpacking, and Prodeus was a huge shocker. But let's say you're not a fan of this list. There is another bundle that I will bring up here. It is the IGN Editor's Choice Club. I know, IGN, blah blah blah, whatever. But look at these games. Disco Elysium, Chivalry 2, Spiritfarer, Forgotten City, and Paradise Killer are all games that I've played and beaten. Of course, not Chivalry 2, beyond the straight review. And most of the ones I've named got top honors in the month I've looked at them. Granted, if you buy every Humble Choice, you have all of the important ones from here, I think. But if you haven't or skipped a month, $16 for all these titles isn't that bad. That being said, we come to the end of this video, and I know I teased a bonus video last month, but certain things took longer to come together than I expected. I am super excited to talk about it, but I am holding back just for a couple weeks. This is something I'm doing outside of YouTube, but could be a good direction for my gaming videos and my channel to go. I think you will enjoy it too. Don't worry though, the monthly Humble video will continue to be covered. I still love these videos, but it's just a second thing I am super passionate about. If you're interested in hearing what's going on or what I'm hinting at, consider subscribing to the channel and ringing the bell. And if you want to help me out more, liking, commenting, or sharing these videos will always be appreciated. See you next time.